Day 6 of training camp continues. Doug Peterson speaks today, as did Carson Wentz. John McMullen was there. We have the latest on our website, 973ESPN.com. Let's dive into some of the news and notes from today's 6 Eagles training camp practice, where, John, it appears that Carson Wentz limited again, as the Eagles have kind of stressed they have a plan. Doug Peterson kind of laughed it off today. He hasn't done 11 on 11 the last 2 days, but he said what he saw last week was enough to ease his mind, even though there is no time frame on there. So is there any change with Carson Wentz, considering we had Jason Avant on earlier today, and he said that he would be surprised, because he had the ACL injury, he would be surprised if Carson Wentz would be able to play. And he thinks that the Eagles should maybe step in there and maybe slow him down a little bit.
No, I think one of the things that people misunderstand is the Eagles are not letting Carson Wentz run the ship. If the doctors tell him, Doug has said that consistently, this is not his decision. It's not Carson's decision. It's the doctor's decision. So ultimately, when they clear him, he'll be out there and playing. From independent doctors, I've talked about it a lot. I've got 9 months. I always point back, and even Jason. Jason obviously is not that old. He's not that far past his NFL career, but even in that short amount of time, there's been tremendous advancements as far as ACL injuries go. I go back to Adrian Peterson. He would be the most high profile, because he tore his later than Carson Wentz in December. The next year, he was there week 1. That was his MVP year. So it's not like Carson would be the first guy to do this. But it will be a doctor's decision. Ultimately, from the Eagles' standpoint, look, they got spooked on Saturday. Doug wouldn't admit it, but that's what happened here. And remember, the only thing left, the only hurdle left to clear is Carson being cleared for contact. And on Saturday, when he was in team drills, there was sort of this scrum around his legs, and everybody kind of had that moment and said, uh-oh. And nothing hit him. He was completely fine. But you could see the light go off, and the Eagles said, you know what? We're going to go back to the more controlled environment. And that was the term Carson used today. They want him in a controlled environment. And that's why the scale back has happened, even though the Eagles won't admit it. But the goal was always week 1. The goal remains week 1. Remember, the only reason people are concerned is he was so far ahead. And once he's out there looking like himself in team drills, they say, okay, it's over. It was never over. He was just ahead of schedule, and nothing's really changed. He's going to be there week 1.
Yeah, and, one of the things that Jason also mentioned was that Nick is kind of the perfect guy for this, because we discussed his time in Philly when Donovan was there and then Garcia kind of took over. And he talked kind of about how there was a little bit of a divide in that locker room, and that this situation, he doesn't see that happening, because Nick is the perfect guy to be able to handle all this.
Yeah, it really is. And the Eagles are lucky in that sense, because it could go in a different direction. It normally would go in a different direction. I think there aren't many quarterbacks who can win a Super Bowl MVP and be accepting of being a back. I think that short list starts with Nick Foles and maybe ends with Nick Foles. Yeah. I can't think of another example of somebody who wouldn't be pushing to start. And I think ultimately he wants to start somewhere else, but he realizes that's just not in the cards here unless Carson is hurt again. So it's a rare situation, and the Eagles are very lucky to have it.
Yeah, now Peterson was asked about why was it the plan to have him practice 3 days with full participation and then scale him back the next 3 days. His answer was pretty blow that question off. That's the plan. Is there a plan maybe moving forward? Do we anticipate seeing more of Wentz as we go through training camp or less of him as we go through camp?
Well, I think you're going to see where he is now, and that's he'll continue to work in individual drills and 7-on-7s, occasionally teamwork. When it's not live, they're going to go live tomorrow. They're going to do some goal line work, so Carson's not going to be in there in live periods because they want it controlled. I think, when Carson spoke, I got him to admit there is some natural. Anybody who's been through rehab knows as you wake up each day, you feel a little bit different. And he admits that some days you have to sort of evaluate. Is this a day I need to scale back? How's the knee recovering? But he also pointed out, and this is the key, there have been 6 practices, as you mentioned. He hasn't missed a practice. He's been out there every single day, including today, has done individual work in 7-on-7 in every single one of them, has not taken a day off, and that's the real positive note. That's pretty amazing.
John, you were there for Bradford when he was returning from this injury. Now, I know he had multiple ACLs, but is Wentz far above where Bradford was? Because Bradford did start week 1 in his first season in Philly. He did play in a preseason game. We do recall him getting everybody really excited, but he was kind of hobbled when they were back at minicamp, and some people were questioning whether he would be ready or not. He ended up being ready, but when you remember Bradford and where you see Wentz, do they look totally different?
Carson, I just, it's tough comparison because the timing is not correct, and Sam was farther along. From if you look at his back-to-back ACLs, that's number one. That makes a difference. But that second one was done in, I believe, the preseason, and he was coming off that. So he had much more time than Carson, who was injured on December 10th. So everybody's different. You have to look at that timing. Darren Sproul's a perfect example. He tore his ACL, but it happened in week 3. I mean, he's a full go. He's ready to play. So you have to look at the timing of each injury. And Carson's was very late. His timetable, even though the Eagles don't like to talk about it, is very close to the start of the regular season. And other guys are not. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, every situation is different. Every athlete is different. I mentioned Adrian Peterson being an MVP, and I use him as an example. He's the better example because he got hurt in December as well, later in December, and was able to come back for week 1 and have his greatest season. And he had a lot of great seasons.
John, I know some people were commenting that the team didn't look very sharp today, and Doug Peterson said that is a fair assessment, that maybe some of that was because they hit yesterday, but you sensing a little, I don't want to say Super Bowl hangover, but a little bit of sloppiness as this team gets out there for the first time since being Super Bowl champions?
No, I think it had more to do with the 97% humidity. It was a miserable day. And you do have the reality, this is the 6th practice now, so if you want to compare it to the old days when you had 2-a-days, okay, these guys have it easy, but it still becomes a grind. And it becomes sort of Groundhog Day at this point of camp, same thing over and over again. So you're going to have a certain amount of sloppiness, and it tends to happen on these types of days where it's just miserable out. It's like playing in soup.
Yes, very soupy out today. That would be a good way to kind of describe the weather today. Today seems to be one of the hotter days that we've had. Of all the guys, red zone work today, and I know you've been glowing about the tight end, Dallas Goedert, and he looks like a guy that is showing the reason why you've been talking very highly about him.
Yeah, I mean, he's just as a receiver. I don't know. I think he's got a lot to prove as a blocker. He wasn't asked to do that at the college level. And as a 6'5", 6'6" guy, 260, I mean, he's got to be in inline tight end at times. So That's a concern. I don't know how that's going to work out. But as far as the receiving part of it goes, I mean, he's tough to deal with. He's just his catching radius is so large, and he's got great hands. And when you can you put those two things together today, I mean, Ronald Darby, for instance, had great coverage on him in the red zone. Ronald Darby's a 6-foot cornerback, and he's 6'6", and he just boxed him out like a NBA player getting a rebound. And you sort of have two of those guys. So at least projecting, you can see Doug Peterson smiling and thinking about having Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert on the field at the same time, and just having these two lengthy tight ends who can just body people up. And then when Alshon Jeffrey gets healthy, you got another long, rangy receiver. So it looks good on paper.
Yeah, and, last year Trey Burton was a pretty, athletic receiver, but not the most physical guy. You got a big target like Dallas Goedert. I'm assuming that Peterson's going to try to find more ways to get him and Ertz on the field together.
Yeah, I would think he's going to at some point, because it just is such. I mean, Trey was a good player, but Trey was 6'2" and 230 pounds, and as I said, this kid's 6'6". They're just in completely different worlds from a physical and a measurable standpoint. And when you add Ertz into the equation, have two of those guys, because Zach is 6'5", he's in the same range. What are you going to do? There aren't too many 6'2" defensive backs. Never mind guys who can deal with 6'5" and 6'6". So again, the matchups look very, very favorable on paper.
Let's branch out from tight end to wide out, and one of the questions today for Doug was that this is the deepest talent-wise wide receiver. He says he thinks so. Would you agree that this is a deeper wide receiving position than the one they had last year?
Yeah, because Mike Wallace is better than Torrey Smith. We've talked about that a lot. You figure Nelson Aguilar is just going to keep getting better and better. Alshon, when he's cleared to practice, in theory, he's going to be healthy. He played hurt last year. And then the depth is greater because you have Marcus Wheaton here, who's pushing the younger guys, and he's an accomplished veteran receiver. And some of those younger guys, Greg Ward, Rashard Davis, people that nobody talks about, the Eagles really are high on. So it is a group. It's amazing. Probably those two. We talked about cornerback a lot, how quickly Howie Roseman and Joe Douglas were able to turn that from a negative into a positive. Same thing at wide receiver. I mean, you can remember, Mike, when Jordan Matthews was here, unfortunately cut by New England today. And I would always tell you he's a volume guy, and people will get excited by the numbers. But that was sort of and I always use that example as a 20-point scorer on a bad NBA team. This group is the best group the Eagles have had at wide receiver in a very long time.
Yeah, I know a lot of people asking about Jordan Matthews. He was cut today by the Patriots, whether or not because of his relationship with Carson, would he fit in? But I don't know that there's any room for him here.
No. Who would you want cut? Who would you want? I mean, you never say never as far as injuries, but he's not going to play. He's not a special teams player. He can't help you there. No, I mean, they've improved at that position.
And is Nelson still lining up as the slot guy? They're not using that big year he had and saying, let's move you out to the outside, are they?
No, and that's specifically why they understand. They went through the disastrous year with Nelson when he was having his confidence problems. Chip was here the first year. They didn't see that, but this staff. But, yeah, they know. Look, they're so formational. He'll play outside at times, but it's not going to be, if you look at the percentages, the outside receivers are going to be Jeffrey and Wallace, and he's going to be mainly in the slot. And you see the difference, what he was able to do because of his speed and explosiveness just much more impactful than Jordan Matthews was. He just was.
Jay Ajayi, last year, they used him. They said they were going to use him in all the different running situations, and that he knew all the plays. But we never saw him really be like the bell cow guy. The guy who really took the ball every 20, 25 times a game. Do you think, from what you've seen now, that Ajayi will be more involved in the offense?
Yeah, he'll be more involved. Doug is on record saying he will be the number one back, but he's going to continue to use the committee approach for a couple of reasons. One, he likes it, and two, Jay, remember, as talented as he is, he got traded for a reason from Miami, a couple of reasons. One, Adam Gase thought he had a bad personality, but the second would be he's got degenerative knee issues. So you got to keep your eye on that, and you got to sort of put him on a pitch count. I don't know if you want to give him the ball 30 times a game. You could argue you can go the Cowboys route with DeMarco Murray and say he's scheduled to be a free agent and just run him into the ground. But they like Corey Clement, and I always tell you, Doug loves Darren Sproles. So when you were gone, I told Ryan a couple times, when there's a key third down situation, it's 3rd, 4th, 3rd and 5, Doug Peterson's going to default to Darren Sproles. He just trusts him more than anybody else. You saw it in his first 2 seasons. Last year, short sample size because he got hurt so early. But that's what happened. Every time there's a big situation in the game, he had Darren Sproles out there. So he likes Sproles and Clement. So it's going to be a committee approach, but Jay's going to be the lead back. So he's going to be LeGarrette Blount this year.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how they fit Ajayi and Clement and Sproles, who's a much different back than Sproles is way different skill-wise than anybody they had last year. Seeing how they figure out how to fit those 3 guys together, I think is going to be intriguing.
Yeah, well, I mean, Darren is so important because he can do everything. He can run the football. He's a great receiver.
Well, they were using him a lot in 3rd down as the blocker. When he went out, that was a problem. Then Corey kind of took that.
By far, yeah.
Right, Corey kind of took that role over last year.
Yeah, and Corey deserves a lot of credit because he really improved as the year went on. But, you're talking about an undrafted rookie who overachieved. Darren Sproles is one of the best pass blocking backs in football, and he has been for a long time. So, I mean, that's an upgrade. So we talk about all the time the Eagles being able to win the Super Bowl. Everybody talks without Carson Wentz, but without Jason Peters, Darren Sproles, Jordan Hicks, they're adding some of their best players back to the mix. It's almost, if you're other teams in this league, it's almost a little bit frightening. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of relying on things. You're relying on intangible things. And we talk about Super Bowl hangovers and human nature and maybe being satisfied. You're relying on things like that because you say, this team was already the best team in football, and now you're adding a Hall of Fame left tackle. You're adding a Pro Bowl middle linebacker. You're adding arguably the guy who would have been the MVP. And you're adding one of the best 3rd down backs in football. That's what's going on. So this is a good football team.
Yeah, and they also added some intriguing pieces that we might not know a lot about. How about like Josh Sweat, the rookie draft choice that maybe fell because of injury?
Yeah, no doubt fell because of injury, and it really was a catastrophic Teddy Bridgewater type injury, but way back in high school. So he's been off it for a number of years. Was one of the highest recruited players coming out of high school in the country. If he wasn't injured, you can envision he would have been a first-round talent, first-round pick. But he had that injury. And, I think Josh Sweat is sort of that developmental prospect that maybe becomes a big deal in 2019. But they're just so deep at defensive end right now. He's not going to play this year. I mean, Brandon Graham's not practicing now, but he'll be back. You have Michael Bennett. You have Chris Long. You have Derek Barnett. They're just ridiculously deep at that position.
Deep at that position, deep at corner, where you said today in your training camp notes at 97.3 ESPN.com, John, that the first-team nickelback was Devontae Ballsby. I can't imagine a scenario where Ballsby beats out Sidney Jones in any capacity.
Well, I can, because I kind of said it a little bit yesterday. I have no idea why you would want to play Sidney Jones in the slot. I can't figure it out. I'd be the first to admit Jim Schwartz knows a lot more about defense than I do, or just about anybody else on the planet, but it just makes no sense to me. When you have somebody that talented at that position, you want them outside the numbers, because that's where all the great receivers are.
Yeah.
And that's where lockdown corners are, outside the numbers. They're not in the slot. So I mentioned it yesterday when we kind of talked about that scenario where Ballsby proves himself and becomes the nickelback. All of a sudden, you want Sidney on the field, and then you start thinking about trading Ronald Darby. That's a possibility. I don't know if any of that's going to happen, but I do know the Eagles want Sidney Jones on the field. I just don't think it's all that beneficial to him or the team, for that matter, to have him in the slot. He's too talented. He's got to be. You're hoping. Remember, this kid would have been a top 15 pick in the draft. Arguably, the Eagles got Derek Barnett at 14. If he isn't injured at his pro day, arguably he's the pick there. And he certainly would have been picked by somebody in that area.
I agree.
So
that was the guy I would have taken at 14 if he was there.
Yeah. So when you take a cornerback that high, you ultimately envision that they are going to be your number one corner.
Right. And Darby and Mills, he's not. I mean, you anticipate Darby or Mills taking a seat if Darby's not moved?
Well, no, that's the problem. I mean, they've both proven themselves. Ronald's a very good player, and Jalen as a Pro Bowl alternate, obviously from seventh round pick to that in 2 years. Jim Schwartz loves him, so it's a good problem to have. And we talked about the depth there.
Right,
it's a great problem to have, but they want to get Sidney Jones on the field. Ultimately, I think if it shakes down and everybody's here and they don't trade Darby, ultimately I've said from early on, and I believe it happens, I think Jalen Mills will be the one who slides inside, and they will let Sidney Jones play outside. But that's just a hunch.
Okay, so your thoughts, is one of those guys gone by the opener?
I think a lot depends on Ballsby. If he proves himself to Jim Schwartz throughout the preseason, and he's comfortable with him being the nickelback, I could see the Eagles spinning off Darby for a couple of reasons. One, it's saying he's a bad player or they don't want him. It's saying that they realize the landscape. This is his last year in his rookie deal, and he's a good enough player where in a league that's always looking for cornerbacks, he's going to get paid a lot, and I mean a lot of money. And this team is still strapped under the salary cap, and they will be next year. So I think when you look at roster building as a whole, we've talked about him a lot, and that's why he's a logical candidate to be moved, because the Eagles are not sure they will be able to keep him because of what he will cost after the season.
He's John McMullen. Follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen. And, of course, you can hear him every day at this time right here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. Eagles Day 7 training camp tomorrow. They'll have an open practice on, Sunday. They have a day off on Saturday. So the Eagles getting ready for next Thursday night against the Pittsburgh Steelers, their preseason opener. Thank you, John.
Hey, thanks, Mike.